The morning Audrey Sinclair realized her husband had never once asked her how she slept. She was standing at the kitchen window watching frost melt off the garden stones, and she thought, "He has lived beside me for 2 years, and he does not know my middle name." She had not planned to think that. She had been reaching for the kettle. Her name was Audrey Lane Sinclair, née Pemberton, and she had married Elliot Sinclair on a Thursday in October of 1908 at St. Michael's Church in Hartford, Connecticut, in a ceremony attended by 47 people, none of whom had asked her whether she wanted to go through with it. Her father had arranged the match in the spring, when the Pemberton family finances had quietly collapsed under the weight of her brother's debts. Elliot Sinclair was 31 years old, solvent and unattached. That had been enough. She had gone to the altar in her grandmother's ivory lace, and told herself it was a practical solution. That was the phrase her father had used. A practical solution, Audrey. You are 23 years old, and the Sinclairs are a good family. She had nodded because nodding was what was called for, and she had married Elliot Sinclair, and she had moved into the Sinclair house on Alderman Street with its dark oak paneling, and its smell of pipe tobacco and old wallpaper. And she had set about being a wife. She had been good at it. That was perhaps the most painful thing. She had learned the preferences of the household staff before she had unpacked her own trunks. She had memorized the names of Elliot's business associates, and their wives, their children, their particular sensitivities. She had managed the accounts, supervised the renovation of the East Wing, organized every dinner party to a standard that Elliot's mother, Mrs. Winifred Sinclair, had described as adequate, which Audrey came to understand was the highest praise the woman was architecturally capable of. She had made herself indispensable in every room of that house, except the one where her husband sat in the evenings reading his papers. The door always slightly open, never quite an invitation. He was not cruel. She wanted to be precise about that, because it mattered. Elliot Sinclair was not a cruel man. He did not raise his voice. He did not demean her in private. He was correct and composed, and occasionally, when something genuinely pleased him, he would look at her across the dinner table with something that could almost be described as warmth. She had spent a long time trying to grow that warmth into something more. She had asked him about his work, about his childhood, about the books he read. He had answered, briefly, and returned to his papers. The first time she understood what she was to him, she had been at a dinner party at the Harrington house on Maple Avenue. She had been standing near the door to the sitting room when she heard Elliot's voice from the hallway, talking to his friend Charles Whitmore. She had not been able to make out all of it. Only pieces. She manages the house well enough. My mother chose well from that point of view. But you know how it is with these arrangements, Charles. It's not as though anyone consulted the heart, and then a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been nothing. She had stood very still in the doorway for a long moment. Then she had gone back to the table and refilled Mrs. Harrington's wine glass and complimented the centerpiece arrangement, and she had not said anything about what she had heard. Not that night, not ever, because what was there to say? He had not been wrong. No one had consulted the heart. That had been the arrangement from the beginning. She simply had not understood until that moment that his indifference was permanent. Not a phase. Not a wall she could eventually find her way around, but the actual architecture of the thing. She went home that night and sat in her room for an hour before she made a decision. She was not going to leave, not yet. Not in the way people meant when they talked about leaving. She did not have the money for it, and she did not have a plan, and she was 24 years old, and the world in 1909 was not constructed for women who simply walked out of adequate marriages. But she was going to stop waiting. She was going to stop arranging herself around the possibility that Elliot Sinclair might one day look at her and actually see her. She was going to do something else with the time. She started with the reading room. It had been a storage space when she arrived, half full of old furniture and rolled carpets that no one had touched in years. She cleared it herself over the course of several weeks, carrying things to the attic in the early mornings before the house was fully awake. She had a carpenter come in to build shelves. She ordered books, history, science, philosophy, 3 volumes on landscape architecture that she had wanted since she was 17, and her father had told her it was not a useful interest for a girl. She told the household accounts it was a sitting room renovation, and no one questioned it because she handled the accounts. She began teaching herself things she had not been permitted to learn. She wrote letters, careful, considered letters, to the Alderman Street Tenement Association, which had been struggling for 2 years to secure funding for a new building on the east side of Hartford. She had read about it in the newspaper and had thought about it for several weeks before she wrote. She did not sign the letters with Elliot's name. She signed them with her own, Audrey Pemberton Sinclair. The association secretary, a woman named Dorothy Fenn, wrote back within a week. And within a month Audrey was attending their Wednesday evening meetings, which she logged in the household diary as charitable engagements, which was accurate and which no one ever looked at closely enough to notice. The meetings were the first place she had been in 2 years, where people listened when she spoke. It was not that she became a different person. She had always been this person. It was more that she stopped trying to be a smaller version of herself in order to fit inside the Sinclair house's idea of what a wife should occupy. She grew, quietly, sideways and upward, in the spaces that Elliot had not thought to fill because he had not thought to look. Elliot did not notice. That was the thing she could not have predicted. How completely invisible a person could be when the person looking at them, had already decided what they were. He noticed the dinner parties had gotten better. She heard him tell his mother so. He noticed that his correspondence was answered promptly, and that the house was well staffed, and that the East Wing renovation had turned out better than expected. These things registered. Audrey herself, the particular woman who had organized them, the particular mind that had managed all of it, that did not register. She was the category wife, and the category was performing adequately, and that was where his attention ended. There was a man named Thomas Becket, who worked with the Alderman Street Association, a solicitor who handled their legal filings pro bono. He was quiet in the way that thoughtful people are quiet, not withdrawn, but deliberate, as though he thought before he spoke as a matter of principle. He had a habit of listening to people's full sentences before he responded. Audrey noticed this about him, because it was so different from what she had become accustomed to. He asked her one evening, after a meeting had run long, and they were the last 2 people left in the association office, what had first brought her to the work. She told him the truth. She said, "I read about the building on Crescent Street, and I thought someone should do something about it, and then I thought, well, why not me?" He had looked at her for a moment. He said, "Most people in your position would have written a check." She said, "A check is easier. I had more time than money." He smiled at that. And she thought, walking home through the November dark, that she had not had a real conversation in so long, that she had almost forgotten what one felt like. She did not allow herself to make anything of it. She was a married woman, and Thomas Becket was a professional acquaintance, and she knew the difference between a genuine conversation and the particular hunger of someone who has been lonely for too long, and begins to mistake ordinary kindness for something more. She was careful with herself about it. She paid attention to the difference. But she also thought about it, walking home, that Elliot had never once asked her a question with that quality of genuine interest. He had asked her questions, yes, about the household, about social arrangements, occasionally about her health. But not that kind of question, not the kind where the answer might actually change something. She was 25 that November, and she had been married for 2 years, and she thought, stepping up the front steps of the Sinclair house, I am going to have to make a decision about this life before it makes one for me. The decision took another year to crystallize. It was not dramatic. That was the thing she would think about later. How undramatic the actual turning point was. She had imagined, vaguely, that when the moment came it would feel like something. A scene, a final argument, a door slamming. Instead it was a Tuesday in October, and she was reading the newspaper at the breakfast table, and Elliot came in and poured his coffee and said, without looking up, "I told Whitmore you'd help organize the Legal Society dinner in March. You're good at that sort of thing." He had not asked. He had told Whitmore she would do it, and then he had told her, and the sequence had been so automatic that she doubted he had even registered it as something she might have a view about. She said, "All right," and she sat there for another moment, looking at her newspaper, and she thought, he will do this for the rest of our lives. Not because he is a bad man. Because he has never once imagined that I might be a person with a different set of preferences about how my time is spent. He has never thought to imagine it, because he has never thought to imagine me at all. She finished her coffee. She went upstairs. She sat down at the desk in the reading room, and she thought for a long time, and then she wrote 2 letters. The first was to Dorothy Fenn at the Alderman Street Association, asking whether they had any connections to the settlement house movement in Boston. The second was to her cousin Harriet. No, not Harriet. She did not have a cousin Harriet. To her cousin in Philadelphia, a woman named Martha, who had worked with the settlement house at Kensington since 1905, and who had written to Audrey twice in the past year asking whether she might ever consider coming out to see the work firsthand. Audrey had not answered those letters. She answered this one. She said, "I have been thinking about your invitation. I wonder if you might have room for me in the spring." She did not tell Elliot about either letter. She went downstairs and she organized the linen count, and she scheduled the furnace inspection, and she planned the menu for the following week. And she went about being a wife so thoroughly and with such practiced ease that nothing about the day would have looked different to anyone watching. The spring came. She told Elliot in February. She said she intended to spend 6 weeks in Philadelphia, assisting with settlement house work. That she had been involved with the Alderman Street Association for over a year, and that this was a natural extension of that work. And that the household was fully managed, and he would not notice the difference. He looked at her across the dinner table with an expression she could not quite read. He said, "6 weeks is a long time." She said, "Yes." He said, "My mother will have opinions about this." She said, "Your mother has opinions about everything. The household will run exactly as it does now. I've arranged it." There was a pause. He looked at her. For a moment she thought he might actually say something real, something that acknowledged that there was a person sitting across from him who had made a decision about her own life. Instead he said, "I suppose if you've arranged it," and returned to his dinner. She left on the 14th of March. She had not expected Philadelphia to change her. She had expected it to be useful. A different kind of work, new problems to solve, the satisfaction of doing something visible instead of invisible. What she had not expected was what happened to her inside it. The settlement house on Kensington Avenue was run by a woman named Louise Hartwell, who was 43 and had never married and did not apologize for either fact. She ran the house with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years figuring out what actually worked. She looked at Audrey on the first morning and said, "Your cousin tells me you're good with accounts and people. I'll need both. Don't be gentle about telling me when something isn't working." Audrey had spent 2 years in a house where her assessments were either unasked for or politely ignored. The experience of being told directly, "Tell me when something isn't working." It hit her somewhere deep, in a place she had been carefully not touching. She worked. She worked in a way she had not been able to work in Hartford, where her competence had to be invisible to be acceptable. Here it was not only visible but required. Louise Hartwell asked her opinion on the funding structure in the second week, and listened to the answer, and implemented 3 of the 4 things Audrey suggested. The 4th she explained, precisely, why she disagreed. Audrey had gone home to her small room that evening and sat on the edge of the bed, and felt something she had difficulty naming at first. She thought it might be respect. She had not realized how long she had gone without it. She wrote to Elliot twice during the 6 weeks. Brief, factual letters about the work. He wrote back once, equally brief, noting that the furnace had needed an additional repair, and that his mother had come to dinner on Sunday and found the soup under-seasoned. Audrey folded the letter carefully and put it in her trunk, and did not think about it for several days. At the end of the 6 weeks, she sat down with her cousin Martha over coffee and said, "I don't know how to go back." Martha did not look surprised. She said, "You don't have to go back the same way you left." Audrey said, "I have a husband and a house and a set of obligations." Martha said, "Yes. And you have also apparently learned something about yourself in 6 weeks that you didn't know before. That information belongs to you. You can take it home with you." She did go back. She came home on a Wednesday afternoon in late April to find the house exactly as she had left it, the staff in their places, the oak paneling as dark as ever, the smell of pipe tobacco still hanging in the corridor outside Elliot's study. He was not there when she arrived. He was at the office, and she walked through the rooms for a moment in her coat, before she had taken it off, just standing in the hallway and looking. She thought, "I am different and this house is the same. That means something." She did not know yet what it meant, but she unpacked her trunk and took her coat off and went to look at the correspondence that had accumulated while she was away, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a person who was passing through a temporary situation rather than a permanent one. Elliot came home for dinner. He looked at her across the table and said, "You look well," she said. "I am well," he said. "Was it useful, the work?" she said. "Very." He nodded and returned to his food. She watched him for a moment, she thought. "You are a man who has never once been curious about what happened to me when you were not looking. In 6 weeks I did significant work, and had real conversations, and was treated as someone with a functional mind, and it reorganized something in me permanently, and you asked if it was useful. And that is as far as your imagination extends." She thought all of this and said nothing and asked him how the Henderson contract had resolved. He told her, with more interest than he had shown in anything she said all evening. She listened, and she thought, I have 6 more months. The 6 months passed. She had gone to Philadelphia to find out whether there was a version of her life she could live. She had come back knowing there was. She spent those 6 months doing the mathematics of it. Not romantic mathematics, not does he love me, do I love him, but the actual mathematics, what she had, what she needed, what was possible. She had almost no money of her own. Her father was gone by then. She had the skills she had built and the connections she had made, and she calculated, approximately enough. She wrote to Louise Hartwell in October and asked whether there was a permanent position at the settlement house, and Louise wrote back within a week with an offer. It was not well paid. It would be enough. She told Elliot in November. She sat down across from him in the evening, when the house was quiet and he had set down his papers, and she said, I am going to leave Hartford in January. I have a position in Philadelphia. I have thought about this carefully, and I am not asking for your permission because I have come to understand that I have been asking your permission for 3 years for things that were mine to decide, and I am done doing that. I want you to understand that this is not something I have done impulsively. I want you to understand that I tried, for 3 years, to be the kind of wife this arrangement required, and I did it well. And it was not enough because the arrangement itself was not designed for a person, it was designed for a function, and I am a person. She had rehearsed that speech a great many times. Saying it out loud, she found it came out more quietly than she had expected. Not angry, just true. Elliot sat very still. He was quiet for a long time. She watched something move through his face that she could not entirely read. Surprise, certainly, and something else, something that looked almost like the beginning of a question he didn't know how to ask. He said, The house, she said. I've written a full account of everything. The staff know their work. The accounts are current. You'll need someone to manage it going forward, but that won't be difficult to arrange. He said, Audrey. She waited. He said, I didn't know you were unhappy. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the ways to respond to that, and she picked the truest one. She said, I know you didn't. That is part of what I'm telling you. She left in January, on a Tuesday, which seemed appropriate. She took 3 trunks and her grandmother's lace and the books from the reading room. She did not take anything that had been his. She took the train to Philadelphia in the early morning, watching the Connecticut countryside give way to open fields, and then back to city. And she did not cry, which surprised her. She had expected to feel something more dramatic. Instead, she felt the particular quiet of someone who has made a hard decision and carried it through to the other side, and found that the other side is simply the next place, the next morning, the next thing. What happened to Elliot Sinclair after Audrey left took longer than she expected to reach her, because she was not paying close attention to Hartford. She heard it in pieces, through letters from Dorothy Fenn and, later, from Mrs. Gerald Ashworth, a woman she had known socially, who wrote to her twice that first year, under the guise of civic correspondence. But actually, Audrey understood, because she was one of those women who felt that wives who left should know what they had left behind. The house on Alderman Street had suffered, not financially. Elliot was not an incompetent man, but in all the ways that turned out to be harder to manage than he had realized. The dinner party invitations dried up in the first season, because the Sinclairs had always been a social unit, and a household with an absent wife and no explanation was a social complication people preferred to avoid. His mother, Winifred, had apparently been vocal in her displeasure, which had resulted in Elliot saying something to her at Christmas that no one repeated in full, but which had clearly been more direct than anything he had said to his mother in living memory. A kitchen fire in March had required the southeast corner of the house to be replastered. He had handled it alone. The Henderson contract, which had been his primary professional concern for the better part of a year, fell apart in February when the other party pulled out. Elliot Sinclair was a competent man and he had recovered. But the recovery had taken 6 months of difficult work, during which, by several accounts, he had been quieter than usual. Audrey was not indifferent to this. She wanted to be precise about that too. She did not read those letters with satisfaction. She read them with something more complicated. The particular grief of looking at a situation you had tried to be part of and been unable to reach, and understanding that your absence had made it legible, in a way your presence never had. She was by then 3 months into managing the Kensington House's new education program, which she had designed herself and which had enrolled 42 women in its first term. She had a room of her own with 2 windows and a view of a sycamore tree. She went to sleep most nights genuinely tired from work that she had done, and she woke up in the mornings knowing exactly who she was. She was thinking about none of this when the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday in October 1910. She recognized Elliot's handwriting on the envelope, the careful, slightly formal script she had seen on notes left on the hall table for 3 years. She held it for a moment before she opened it. He had written 4 pages. She had not known he was capable of 4 pages. He had written about the house. He had written about the Henderson contract. He had written about the Hendersons' mother, in terms that surprised her with their self-awareness. Acknowledging that he had spent a great deal of his life accepting Winifred's assessments of things without examining them closely enough. He had written about the dinner party at the Harrington house, and she understood from the way he wrote about it that someone had told him what she had heard in the hallway. He did not say who, but he knew, and he was not pretending otherwise. He had written, "I said what I said to Whitmore because I had been careless with myself, and I was covering for it with a kind of humor that was not humor at all. I have thought about it many times. I did not know you were standing there, and I understand that this does not constitute an excuse." She read that sentence twice. He had written near the end, "I am not writing to ask you to come back. I am writing because I think I allowed 3 years to pass in which I never adequately acknowledged that you were the reason the house ran, and the reason the dinner parties were worth attending, and the reason I was considered a man with a well-managed life. I said none of that when you were here, because I did not understand that it needed to be said. I understand it now. I wanted you to know that I understand it now." And then, in the last paragraph which she read 3 times, "If you were ever willing to speak with me, I would be grateful for the opportunity. I am not entitled to it. I am only saying that I would be grateful." She put the letter down on her desk. She looked out the window at the sycamore tree, which had gone gold and was beginning to lose its leaves. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the 3 years. She thought about the window in the kitchen, and the frost on the garden stones, and the morning she had reached for the kettle, and understood that he did not know her middle name. She thought about the reading room, and the letters to Dorothy Fenn, and the train to Philadelphia in the January cold. She thought about Louise Hartwell saying, "Tell me when something isn't working." She thought about how long it had taken her to understand that she had been waiting for someone to ask. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Dear Elliot, I received your letter. I am not in a position to offer you the reassurance of a quick answer, and I think you understand why. What I can tell you is that I read what you wrote carefully, and I believe you mean it. I am not the same person who left Hartford in January. I want you to understand that clearly, not as a warning, but as information. If we were ever to speak again, it would be as 2 people who are each entirely different from the 2 who sat across that dinner table for 3 years without ever quite reaching each other. I don't know if that is something you want. I don't know yet if it is something I want, but I am willing to find out. That is what I can honestly offer you." She sealed it. She set it on the corner of her desk to be posted in the morning. Then she went back to work. The sycamore outside the window dropped another leaf, and the afternoon light came in low and golden across her desk. And Audrey Pemberton Sinclair, who had learned in the past year that she was a person capable of more than she had been permitted to be, bent her head over the enrollment figures for the spring term and felt, in the complicated, unresolved way of real things, something that was not quite happiness and not quite hope, but was perhaps the quiet beginning of both.